All right. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm so happy to be with all of you. Hope you're all doing okay. And I want to start by saying we had very much hoped that we could be in person tonight, which is why we're starting at 7 o'clock. And we have to take care of a few more internal logistical things in order to do this hybrid and do it well. So hopefully by next month, we might be able to do it with some folks in person and some online, but we'll do it a little bit earlier if we're not in person, so that our folks from the East Coast and elsewhere can join us at a more decent hour. But I'm really happy to be with all of you, and I want to invite you to just take a moment whenever you are comfortable now or throughout the night, and just say hello in the chat. And if you're not here in LA, let us know where you are learning with us from tonight. So Rabbi Kasher and I envisioned this class to be in some way a continuation, Luana from Maine, hello, to be a continuation of some of the Limmud Tzedek learning that we were doing together just a few months ago before the summer and High Holy Days came. And the idea is that at Ikar, all of our justice work is organized under the umbrella of Minyan Tzedek. That's the Hebrew term that we use as for all of our social justice initiatives. And we really wanted to offer, as Limmud Tzedek meetings happen once a month on Tuesdays, that on another evening once a month on Tuesdays, we'd have an opportunity to do some learning so that we could understand more of the philosophical, theological, textual foundations and spiritual foundations for some of the core commitments that we hold dear as a community, and some of the things that really take us to the streets when it matters most. And so tonight, I wanted to share with you something that might seem a little bit surprising as a justice subject, but you'll see how it is over the course of our hour together this evening. Tonight, I want to talk about grief, and in particular about prophetic grief. So I shared with some folks over Shabbat that last week I was invited to do a Torah study with survivors of the massacre in Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh at 3 of the synagogues, Dor Chadash, New Light, and Tree of Life. And these were survivors and families of the victims. And a number of people asked me what we learned together. And so I decided I would share it here with all of you. This is Limmud Tzedek. This is the study of justice, because as we'll see, this is about not only the nature of grief, but the way that grief, in particular public grief, can be both an act of love and a path to justice. And so I'm looking forward to sharing with you this material, and I'm especially moved to be able to share this with you now, both in memory of those whose lives were taken 3 years ago in this terrible massacre in Pittsburgh, and also because it helps connect us to the Torah portion, to the part of the Torah that we're reading this time of year. So some of you know, many of you know, that just last Shabbat, we read Parshat Chaye Sarah, which begins in Genesis chapter 23. And what I'm going to do here is just share with you my screen. So give me one sec. Here's the text so that, oh, do you know what? I just realized I have there's an easier one to follow if I can find it quickly. 1 second. Okay, you think that, there we go. Okay, I think you'll be able to read this one a little bit better. Sometimes the Sefaria texts the way that they're formatted on the page makes it a little bit difficult to follow. So let me give you this. Okay, there's the Google Doc. I have to give you sharing privileges. Hold on. I changed the formatting of it, but I did not, I didn't open it up to share it. Hold on, I'm going to say anyone what this link can view. Okay, you should be able to get in now. So I hope folks can see this text. And in any case, I'm going to share the screen with you. Can you see it? Did anyone try to open it yet? Okay, good, great. Okay, so here's the share screen. So this journey begins with the opening lines of Chayei Sarah, the parsha that we read just this past Shabbat. And I want to say that this idea of that I want to share with you tonight was inspired by a shiur that I learned from Erin Lieb-Smokler over the summer. And actually, she wrote about it in a book that she published during this time of COVID called Torah in the Time of Plague. And it's an incredible Devar Torah. And so that's where the original insight for this comes from. I'll show you what part is hers, and then you'll see where I want to take it to be a conversation about grief, and in particular about prophetic grief, an act of love, and a path to justice. So when Chayei Sarah begins, as many of you know, the opening line of the parsha says, "Vayihi Chayei Sarah 100 shana ve'esrim shana ve'sheva shanim shnei Chayei Sarah." So it was that the life of Sarah was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. That was the life of Sarah. Vatamet Sarah b'kiryat arba, and then Sarah died. And many people before us have noted the very strange irony that the parsha that's called Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, actually begins by telling us how long she lived before she died. And many people, including the Eish Kodesh, including the Rabbi Kalana Miskalman Shapira, whom Rabbi Morris Panitz quoted in his incredibly beautiful sermon on Shabbat, many people note that Sarah's death at the beginning of Parshat Chayei Sarah must be connected to the story, the narrative that came just before it. And if you remember from last Shabbat, the story that came immediately before Sarah's death is actually the story of Akedat Yitzchak, the story of the binding of Isaac. Now, there are a lot of midrashim that will make this point. Many rabbis do it in very profound and beautiful and different and creative ways. Some of our rabbis will tell us that Sarah was tricked into thinking that Abraham, her husband, had actually gone through with the sacrificing of their son Isaac, and he died. And when she heard that, she died from grief herself. She couldn't live if her child was no longer alive. Some of the rabbis actually offer an interpretation that say that Sarah died not because of the grief of knowing that, of believing that Isaac had died, but because she realized that for Abraham to have been willing to engage in that act, that horrible, heinous, violent act, she must have been in some way responsible, because she had years before forced Abraham to sever the bond of fatherhood with his son Ishmael. And therefore, years later, when God called him to do the same thing with Isaac, he was already well practiced in doing so. And so she died from grief, thinking that it was her fault. But Rashi has a different way of understanding this. And so I want to bring us to what Rashi's interpretation is here. So Rashi says that the narrative of the death of Sarah follows immediately on the story of the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, because through the announcement of the binding, that her son had been made ready for sacrifice and had almost been sacrificed, she received a great shock. Literally, her soul flew from her and she died. And here he's citing Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. Excuse me. So what then is the reason, according to Rashi, that Sarah dies after the Akedah? Because she understood that her son had almost, kimat shelo nishchat. He had almost died. And that was so shocking for her. It was so disturbing for her that she actually could no longer live. Okay? The news that her beloved child had come that close to death was enough to make her lose her ability or her will to live. And I want to bring you to what this text that comes from the Maharal of Prague, who's writing in the 16th century, what he says about that. So he says, that Sarah learned that Isaac was almost sacrificed. He says, it seems that because Sarah heard that Isaac was almost sacrificed, that just a small thing, a davar mu'at, kept him from dying. For this reason, she was shocked. She experienced nivhala. This is the way of humanity, he says, to be shocked upon hearing that only a small thing has kept a person alive. So what happens to Sarah in that moment is that she realizes not that he's dead. She knows he's still alive, but she recognizes the incredible fragility of life, right? She recognizes just how close he was to dying, and therefore just how close one could be to dying. And it absolutely shocked her to the core. So I want to pause there for a moment and just ask you to reflect on this, if you will, with me. And I'll share with you that last week I was, by the way, if your cameras are off because you're eating, I would rather see your faces. Don't feel bad about eating while learning. I think it will only enhance the food and the Torah. Yeah, there you go. A couple people. I want to thank you. Thank you, folks. Hi, it's like we're having dinner together now. So last week I was driving my kids to school, and it was early in the morning, and I got to a red light, and I was turning left onto Fairfax. And when the light turned green, I turned left. And at that moment, there was a pedestrian that was trying to cross the street. And at the same time that I got the green, he also got the white man that says that you can walk. And my car came within an inch of this man. He was totally in my blind spot. I absolutely could not see him. And thank God he's okay and we're okay. But I realized I was standing at the edge of a cliff. And I'm giving this example where thank God everyone is okay. Because I think the point of what's coming to us in the Gurarye, what's coming from the Maharal, and what Rashi's pointing to is there are moments even when everybody's okay, and thank God they're okay, in which the shock of what almost happened is enough to turn you upside down and inside out. And just today, we heard the story of a beloved member of our community who, thank God, is okay, who parked her car and opened up the door to get out of the car, and another car came speeding down the road and knocked her door off her car. And if she had stood up 1 second earlier, she would not be okay. And we all know about these moments, right? You might be the most empathic among us right now are really feeling it in your body. Where is it located in your body? This feeling that I'm describing, it's like in your throat or in your gut. Yeah, Barbara's feeling it in the belly. It's like you know that feeling, that moment where you recognize how absolutely precious and fragile it all is. And had it gone slightly differently, we would not be standing where we are, right? And we have a ritual for it. This happens so often that we have actually ritualized. We say, we bench Gomel, we say Birkat Gomel on Shabbat. And we ask the whole community to stand up and we just say, thank God. Something happened and it could have gone differently than it did, but it didn't, and it doesn't feel right to not mark it and not to express our gratitude. So that's what, according to the Maharal of Prague, that's what happened to Sarah in that moment. She realized that just a small thing, just me catching a glimpse of the guy out of the corner of my eye, was right in the blind spot in the front windshield, but just me catching the glimpse made me stop. But the knowledge that we were that close to disaster is enough to shock her system into death. That's what happened to Sarah. And look at what now comes next. And here again, I'm thanking Erin Lieb-Smokler for this, because she is the one who shared with me both the Maharal of Prague and Aviva Zornberg. So this whole idea actually originates in the writings of Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, brilliant contemporary teacher of Torah. So this is what Aviva Zornberg says. What is Behala? Okay, remember he said up here, for this reason she was shocked, nivhala. So she says, what do you mean she was shocked? You could say it's something like shock, but nivhal, it's not exactly shock. It's more like dizziness. It's more like nausea. It's vertigo, right? There's a reason Barbara held her belly just now when I said this, right? It's not knowing where you are. It's a shock in the sense of a loss of orientation. I don't know at all where I am in the world, she says. It's a very common reaction to a situation in which one is almost. The reaction is a sense of theological vertigo, of asking, what does anything mean in that case? If it's really just a matter of a millimeter, if it could go this way or that way, how am I supposed to even understand God's providence? How can I understand anything in view of such events? Sarah, says Aviva Zornberg, does not die thinking that Isaac is dead. She knows that Isaac is alive, but she knows he's only alive by a hair's breadth. And that immediately sets everything awry and does something absolutely radical to her sense of order and her sense of coherence in the world. The knowledge that he's only alive, her precious child is only alive by a hair's breadth, does something radical to her sense of order and coherence in the world. I'm going to pause there for a moment, because I want to hear how you're taking this in. What does this idea sound like? What is it? Where's the resonance here for you? You can feel free to raise your hand or pop your name into the chat if you'd like. Can anyone resonate to what Zornberg's writing about that dizziness, that nausea, the theological vertigo? What's the meaning of anything if all of this could have turned upside down in an instant? Kathy, hi. Good to see you.
I was just going to say that it completely resonates with me because, 2 years ago, I had a bad attack of vertigo that lasted for a while. And actually, I still feel the effects of it. But it is really hard to describe because it's the kind of vertigo I have. There are different kinds. But mine is with the vestibular nerve, some inflammation of the vestibular nerve. But basically, it's that, especially when I turn my head, my brain doesn't necessarily tell my body where my head is. So my head is literally, and the rest of my body aren't exactly connected properly. Now I'm okay, and I do physical therapy. I mean, I'm taking this all very literally, like what you're talking about, but it's just it is a very weird sensation. And then this sense that, all my life I took this, of course, when my head moves, my body knows where my head is. And then there are other implications too, just in terms of it's a process that's almost forced me. Well, I was meditating before it happened, but at the beginning, the only relief I had was stillness. And at first I sort of saw that as a problem. I mean, it was sort of like, but now I sort of see it almost like enforced meditation, but then my body and my head know where each other are. But anyway, again, it's a little bit literal, but it's.
No, it's great, Kathy. It's so great. Thank you so much for saying that. Your body and your head are in a different place, right? And that's exactly what she's describing based on this reading of the Maharal of Prague, based on Rashi, based on Pirkei Rav Eliezer. What they're all describing is that his body is intact, but her in her head, the body and the spirit are no longer in the same place, and so she's off. Sure. So, and when you have vertigo, it's very dangerous, right? Like you can fall, you can't drive safely, like, because you're not able to, you're completely imbalanced, right? I'm going to come back to this in a moment. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I hope you're feeling better. And it sounds like the stillness and the physical therapy are doing their work. So thank you for sharing that, Kathy. Dana and then Janet.
Hi, this is just really wonderful. It's my first time in this space, and yeah, just really powerful and grateful to be here. So, but yeah, I was just thinking about how what was resonating for me is how so often it's actually during moments of crises that we like kind of, or at least I'll speak for myself, like shut down emotionally and kind of can't feel all the things. And then it's this strange experience that once you have that sense of relief, you know, so like going through a medical crisis in my family, or the intensity of being on the academic job market for me, like you just kind of like go. And then once something good happens at the end, you can kind of have that sense, you're expecting relief, but in fact, what can happen is you start to actually feel all the things that you have been going through because you can finally allow yourself to feel them. And I think that like the ways that can like be, you know, what your expectations are for relief, and then your actual feelings of being so disoriented and like, yeah, like that could just be extremely jarring and disorienting.
That's great. Thank you, Dana, and welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. It's what you're saying is something similar to what Lori Myers is writing. And Lori, I hope I'm gonna try to paraphrase this, but you can also feel free to jump in, and then I'll come to you in a second, Janet. That this feeling, this experience is a little bit like what many people are experiencing after COVID. That who would have thought, Lori writes, that there was something that could cause so much crisis and death and literally shut down the world. And then we're expected to bounce back and new normal, but it's really hard to reset because, as Dana points out, after it's over, after the rush of just, we need to survive, you dedicate everything to just surviving. Then all of a sudden there's the realization of just what we've been through. And yesterday they told us that now more than 5 million people worldwide have died from COVID, and more than 700,000 Americans have died in the last year and a half from this thing that didn't exist 2 years ago. And worse, and like we've all been, we've taken those body blows again and again. I mean, remember when the first 200 cases happened and we were shocked and stunned and upset, and then all of a sudden it's just body blow after body blow. And at some point when we get through this, there's going to be damage to the system, right? Like being that close to death and to grief and to disaster, even if your family remains intact, being that close to that much suffering and loss has to take a toll. And that toll, in Aviva Zornberg's language, is theological vertigo. It's if you don't fall apart a little bit, if you don't collapse a little bit from everything we've been through, then maybe you're not paying attention, right? But if you become aware of the almost of it, then you can't stay on your feet all the time. And so I think there's something very profound about that. Janet, I saw you took your hand down. Do you still want to make your comment, or do you want to hold it for later? Okay. Does anyone else, there's one other thing that I wanted to share here about, Gloria. Thank you, Gloria, for lifting up Simone Biles here. And I think this is the twisties, right? Something happened there. Right. Something happened to Simone Biles, in which her mind and her body were no longer completely in sync. and she hit a kind of vertigo and had to step away in order to save her own life, right? And I think that, I mean, the twisties, I know there were probably a lot of High Holy Day sermons about the twisties this year, because it's such a powerful idea. The idea that we can get out of sync, our hearts, our minds, and our bodies out of sync. I'm drawn to the way that Zornberg talks about this, taking the idea of that dizziness, nausea, imbalance, and calling it a theological vertigo because of the recognition that it's not that something's wrong with me. It's that something's wrong with God and with the world. How could God design the human community in such a way that we could actually be that close to that level of disaster and disruption? And that theological crisis is what led to Sarah's death. I'm going to go to Madeline. Hi.
Hi, I'm new too. This is one of my first things that I participated in. And I think it's kind of one of those things like when you one of those moments where like when you've had children and you're just kind of like going through the motions of your day to day. And then like 5 years later, you'll kind of turn around and all of a sudden have like a unique awareness that here I am, like I'm in life, like almost like an existential crisis. Like you're aware of where you are in your life and you're aware that you're aware. It's almost like one of those moments where a character in a story kind of like becomes self-aware. And that's how I'm relating to that. It's like, that's the moment where you realize, okay, this is life. This is the life that I'm in. And you kind of get like a meta feeling about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Madeline, and welcome. Thank you. Rabbi Kasher.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I keep thinking about the emphasis that you placed on the almost in the Aviva Zornberg text. And it's powerful in itself that just even almost did this to her. But it actually makes me wonder, like, if he had, like the way it's phrased, it's almost like if he had died, maybe she wouldn't have died because she'd be in a different state. She'd be raging or need to mourn or need to commemorate him. But like actually everything that people are describing, this sort of shaky, insecure state of being like that hair's breadth that you're talking about is I mean, it's sort of absurd to suggest if he had died, she wouldn't have died, but there's a way in which, like, I almost hear her saying that, you know, it makes me wonder if there's something particular about the almost that's actually more like the door that got ripped off the car. It's like a little more shaky. If someone gets hit, we go to the hospital, we deal with it. You know what I mean? It's worse, but it's a different psychic state.
It's so interesting that you say that. I mean, there's something, the problematic state here is the state of uncertainty. It's the state of chaos that comes in the gray, right? And it's the not knowing that's so painful for her. Or the knowledge that it's also fragile and close to the edge. That's so interesting. I'm going to go to Josh and Claire, and then we'll continue. Hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you. I don't mean this in a contrarian way, but I've had some experiences where I felt like these moments can be positive and jolting me out of kind of mundane, kind of small-mindedness and realizing, kind of getting the profound picture of like how thin the edge of existence is. And I remember like being stuck on a road in Vermont in the passenger seat and it like starting to snow a lot and my friend driving and the car skidding out and there being just several seconds where no one was in control. And we saw the edge of this road with like a big drop off on the edge of it as like the car was just coming to it. And for several seconds, we were just sitting there waiting, and then the car stopped, and we didn't roll over. And thankfully, and obviously, it was really messed up. But like, I had this weird, I just laughed a lot afterwards, uncontrollably, kind of. And I felt like it did kind of, obviously, not a good thing to happen, but it did in some ways jolt me out of kind of mundane, like day to day thinking, and feel like. It was kind of similar to the feeling of being on top of a mountain or looking at the sky, just like seeing the vastness or something.
That's incredible, Josh. And that's exactly the direction that I want to take us in. So it's a perfect way for us to transition. I think what the texts are leading us to is the awareness of how very dangerous that realization can be. The theological vertigo can kill us, right? That grief for everything that was lost, not only those who died, but the sense of safety and security, that's irretrievable. The recognition of how vulnerable we are, how precious life is, all of that actually killed Sarah. It can kill us. It's so destabilizing. It can kill us. But then there's Josh Weiss. And Josh Weiss says, well, actually, if it doesn't kill you, it may actually give you a different perspective on life. And I wonder if anyone else, as we're talking about all of this, start to think about Yom Kippur, about how this most important and central day for us, for Jews, actually is rooted in the principle that we must go to the edge of the abyss and look over and see before us life and death and know how fragile it is and understand and recognize how very precious it is and understand the almost, right? Isn't that in some way the purpose of this whole ritual experience that we center our year around? There's something so powerful, so important spiritually and theologically about lifting the veil. And the goal there is not to scare the life out of us. The goal is to help us live differently, to live more meaningfully, to reintroduce laughter into our hearts, right? To reintroduce a sense of purpose and connection. It's tshuva and tefillah and tzedakah. It's recognizing that life is so fragile. What can I do to repair the broken relationships? And how can I cry out to something or someone bigger than me? And what can I do to make the world more just? In our tradition, that is also the response to the almost, right? It can kill you, but it could actually give you back life too. And so the question that I think we have to ask is, how do we make the awareness of the davar mu'at, the little thing that can keep us from life and from death, actually is an empowering idea that keeps us in this world and helps us live even more meaningfully in this world. And so here, I want to invite us to think a little bit about the way that we hold grief and the way that we hold awareness of almost grief. I already shared with you the idea of Birkat HaGomel, which I wish now that I had put on this source sheet. I shared with you that when one experiences this near-death moment, when we go through a trial, something that tests us, immediately we're called to stand in front of the community and acknowledge that we are the recipients of an act of grace. There, but for the grace of God, right? It could have gone another way. It does sometimes go the other way, but I made it to the other side. And the whole community has to say amen to that. Just as God has given you grace in this moment, which we don't at all understand why you received grace, but someone else didn't receive grace. We don't at all understand why you caught a glimpse of the guy in the driver's side window for a second, sooner than would have been the worst day of everyone's life. And yet you did. And so you immediately contextualize it with a liturgy of grace before a community that responds by saying, we see that you have received this grace. May you continue to receive such blessings, right? And then, and that same idea, that same kind of ritualizing a theology of both gratitude and also communal dialogue is also what we do, not in the almost, but what we do when death inevitably is the result of these moments, when it sometimes ends up that the person is lost. And so here, I want to bring you to this idea that for those, a few of you said that you're new here tonight, I've been talking about this idea for years that I've been struggling with and thinking about the way that we look at Mourner's Kaddish, not so much as an expression of words that are rooted in a particular theology, but as a ritual that's rooted in a theology. So when we say Yitzgadal v'yikadash Shemei Rabbah, the very power of that prayer is not make God's name be exalted and make God's great name be exalted. But the theology that we're actually putting forward is the Amen. It's the people who respond to those words by saying Amen. And you can look here and forgive me for those who've been around and who know how I feel about this text. But I'm just going to share this with you so that you can visualize it. I only understood this once I saw the Koren Sidur, which has a beautiful Jonathan Sachs commentary in it, where it's laid out, and you can see it in the English, but it's laid out the way it is on the right in the Hebrew, where the mourners speak, and then the community speaks, and then the mourners speak, and then the mourners and the community speak together. Then the mourner again, then the community, then the mourners, then the community. And you can see here, in whether you're looking at the Hebrew or the English, the Kahal says Amen, 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 Amen. And what's happening here is that we're engaging in a theology of dialogue. We're engaging in a ritual that is a container to hold grief, a place to go when you're experiencing theological vertigo, either because of the almost, or because of the actual. What do we do when our world turns upside down? And the answer from the tradition is you show up, you say words that are an expression of gratitude and grace. And most importantly, even more importantly than the words themselves, is the way that those words are then received by a community of fellow travelers who you may know and you may not know, whose only job in that moment is to take your dizziness, your nausea, your disruption, and create a sense out of nonsense for you, to sort of create the container that can hold you when you're feeling vertigo. This is the person who's walking beside you when the vertigo strikes and keeps you from falling down to the ground, and can actually point you to what way is right. And years ago, I talked about spatial disorientation and spiritual disorientation, some Rosh Hashanah years ago. And I don't know if any of you remember this, but this is this idea that I'm so drawn to, that like it happens to scuba divers and to pilots, but they experience some external stimulus, and even very experienced pilots and divers experience this. They experience some stimulus and it scares the hell out of them. And it turns them upside down. It puts them into a kind of vertigo where they're nauseous and they're dizzy, and they cannot for the life of them figure out which way is north. And it threatens their lives. Not the external stimulus, but the upset to their system threatens their lives. And they end up swimming in exactly the wrong direction, or flying the plane in exactly the wrong direction. And the aviation experts say that what you do when you're experiencing, I started reading aviation manuals several years ago before High Holy Days to try to understand this, because I thought when I was reading about spatial disorientation that it sounded a lot like what I was experiencing with people who had come in for counsel, who were coming to talk to me as a rabbi after they had experienced a loss, or after they'd experienced an almost loss. And I realized that disorientation that the pilots feel is the same disorientation that we feel after a miscarriage, after a near death, after a death, after a divorce, after a breakup. This is the same experience. And so I thought, I wonder what they tell the pilots to do when they're experiencing it. I started to read these aviation manuals, and what they say is you have to trust your instruments, right? You have to trust your instruments. And so I want us to think about what our instruments are. What are the things that we can trust? The same way that when Kathy's has it, when the vertigo strikes and Kathy's feeling uncertain on her feet, Hal can hold her straight because Hal is like her instrument, an instrument of love, right? But what is the instrument that will hold us up when we feel, either because of an actual loss or an almost, we feel just completely turned upside down? And those instruments are in many ways, from the position of our tradition, those instruments are the rituals of that put us in dialogue with each other. It's about going to community and saying what you've experienced out loud and having people say, thank God. Thank God you're okay. It was a near miss. Or, amen. I see you and I hear you, and I'm not going to let you experience this alone. I'm going to sit with you as long as you need. Amen, 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 amen. It's so repetitive, right? We don't just say amen at the end. We interrupt to say amen. Yikadav Yikadav Shemei Rabbi is not a sentence. It's a half sentence. We interrupt that sentence in order to say amen. Okay. So why is this for Limmud Tzedek? So why am I bringing this to us tonight in the context of this conversation? Because I want to share with you, I want to share with you an idea that comes first, or I first encountered through a teacher called Walter Brueggemann, who's a Christian theologian. And it's the idea of prophetic grief. And what Brueggemann says is that, have you heard about prophetic grief? I've preached about this a couple times over the years, but it's such a powerful idea. So he says that when the prophet grieves on two levels. On the first level, the prophet's grieving for the suffering of a people that he cares deeply about, right? I see that you are in pain and I grieve. On the second level, the prophet grieves for what is transparent and clear to the prophet, all of the suffering, but is unseen or is denied by other people. So I don't know how many of you have read Abraham Joshua Heschel's Prophets. The introduction to the Prophets is one of the most powerful essays about our prophets, and he writes about this. He writes about how the cries of human beings suffering, which are largely inaudible somehow to most people, are a piercing cry in the night to the prophet, right? The prophet hears what other people don't hear, and the prophet can't bear that suffering. So prophetic grief is when the prophet sees that people are hurting, and also sees that there's a kind of suffering that's unseen to other people and that's denied to other people. And that expression of prophetic grief, that active mourning, that engagement in the work of sorrow, especially when it's done publicly, like our Jewish tradition calls us to do it, when we bench Gomel and when we say Mourner's Kaddish, that kind of public mourning and expression of sorrow, according to Brueggemann, is absolutely essential to the process of transforming our society. If you don't cry out about the human suffering that is largely inaudible to most people because we have psychic numbness, right? I just said earlier, 700,000 Americans died in the last year and a half. It's unimaginable loss, right? It's unthinkable. It's horrific. And yet we're totally functioning, right? We're going to work and we're doing our email and we're making dinner. And so unless we actually engage in the anguish when there is such profound human suffering, we will never be able to offer a vision of what could be instead. So expressing our grief, our rage, our anguish at the massacre that happened in Pittsburgh and Squirrel Hill 3 years ago last week, expressing our anguish, our sorrow about it is both because we're grieving for the suffering that those families and those individuals experienced, but also because we are expressing that we're awake to a kind of suffering that other people don't see, don't care about, or actively work to deny. So engaging in that kind of grief is actually prophetic grief, because it's lifting up the possibility that there could and there should and there must be a world where that kind of suffering no longer exists. And that's why I think communal public expressions of grief and sorrow are absolutely critical to building a different kind of future. So there's a line from Brueggemann that I love so much. He says, suffering made audible produces hope, right? When we suffer out loud, we're expressing that something happened that should not have happened in the world. And that's ultimately hopeful, because that creates the space for us to imagine, for us to dream, for us to envision different kind of reality than the reality that we currently live in. And I want to just share with you one last quote about prophetic grief that and then I'll close and we can talk about it for our last few minutes. So some of you know my friend, Reverend Otis Moss III, who is an incredible pastor at Trinity Church in Chicago, which is President Obama's church in Chicago. And Otis Moss, he comes from a long line of preachers. His father, he's OM3, he's Otis Moss III. His father is Otis Moss Jr. And you can guess what his grandfather's name was. And so sometimes my friend Otis will preach with his father, who is also an exceptionally brilliant teacher and preacher. They're both incredible. And one day Otis is going to come preach at Ikar. And so what I want to share with you here is after the murder of 9 Black worshipers during a Bible study in Charleston's Mother Emanuel AME Church, Reverend Otis Moss and his father preached together. And they lifted up in this incredible sermon the idea of prophetic grief. And I think reading their words will help us bring together all of the threads that I've shared so far, and really help us understand how prophetic grief, public grief, is both an expression of love and an act of justice. So here's what Reverend Otis Moss Jr. said. Prophetic grief is more than crying and sighing and weeping and mourning. Prophetic grief is planting gardens of healing in the midst of raindrops of blood. Prophetic grief is declaring to the world that love is stronger than hate, that God's grace is greater than our grief, that God's power is greater than our pain. Prophetic grief is planting gardens of healing in the midst of the raindrops of blood. So I'm so compelled by this idea of prophetic grief, because what it means is that grief needs to be affirmed. It needs to be lifted up. It needs to be held. And there's a transformative power. There's a transformative power to that grief when we put it in the right container. And Sarah died from an almost death. The knowledge and awareness of the fragility of life was enough to just make her fall apart, because she did not have a container to hold grief. And we are called to be as aware as Sarah is of the fragility of life, but not to die, but to live. And the way that we do that is by placing that almost that theological vertigo, that nausea and dizziness in the container of Birkat HaGomel. And when it's not an almost, and when it is actually 9 Black worshipers at Charleston's Mother Emanuel AME, and when it is 11 Jewish worshipers who go into Tree of Life Synagogue on a Shabbos morning hoping to daven and don't make it out, then the vertigo, the the dizziness, the nausea, the nonsense of life is even more profound. And our tradition says to us, so cry out in pain, but not into the dark of night where nobody can answer you. In the context of community that can hear you, that can feel you, that can see you, that can sit with you, that won't look away when you're hurting the most. And that's the space where prophetic grief can actually turn into a process of healing. And I just want to invite us to think about what it means to hold that redemptive possibility, that the awareness of the fragility of life, that our encounter with death and with almost death can actually lead to the reordering of our society, because it creates the space for us to cry out that something that has been is not what it should be. If Sarah knew that there was a safe way for her to say, my husband almost murdered my child, if there was a community that could have heard her say that and said, may God give you grace, we hear you and we see you, she would not have died, right? So what can we do with our own grief so that we don't put it away and continue pushing forward, like Dana was saying, and hope that one day it doesn't just all come out and we all collapse, but so that we acknowledge the pain and the suffering. We see the actual loss and we see the invisible loss, the thing that others around us are not able to see because they won't allow themselves indulge in it. And then actually use that pain and that suffering to envision a different kind of reality, a different kind of future. So we have a couple of minutes left. I would absolutely love to hear what this means to you, what your thoughts are, what resonates, what doesn't, maybe, as a foundation for us building forward. Does anyone have any thoughts? Hi, Janet. Now you'll. Okay, we'll hear from Janet and Dan. And by the way, I see that Andrea. Thank you for posting. You can put Birkat Gomel in the if you share it with everyone, that's great, so that they can see it.
I just wanted to share. I was thinking when you were talking that we can understand what dying of a broken heart means. What, like, if a parent loses a child, and they just want to die of a broken heart, and how we have to help them and surround them with love so that they can continue for their other children or for their family. Thank you for this teaching.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you. I saw that somebody wrote earlier in the night. Marla and John. John says that there's a real medical condition called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, broken heart syndrome, as Janet said. Thank you, John. I've never heard about that, but thank you for sharing that. Dan, did you want to say something before we close? I don't know where. I guess not. I don't see you.
It's okay.
Oh, there you are. Okay. All right. Well, on that note, I want to just offer you all a blessing. If you're paying it all attention, you've got at least a little bit of a case of the twisties right now, right? I mean, we have to, like, just thinking about what we've all been through since last November, because we just entered November today, from election to insurrection, to all kinds of upheaval, to climate code reds, to losses, both personal, national, and global. So much. There's so much heartache, and we want to be awake and we want to pay attention to it. And I think what I want to offer us is that there is a way to pay attention, not to check out to the human suffering, but to pay attention in the context of a community that can hold you when you experience the theological vertigo, a community that Sarah did not have, but that we thankfully do. That story should have ended differently than it did, but our story can. And it doesn't only mean helping hold each other up when we're falling over, but taking the vertigo, taking the awareness, and actually building a different kind of reality and a different kind of future for everybody else from it. With that, I'm going to thank you for being with us tonight. It's really beautiful to learn together. I think Rabbi Kasher has us slated for the first Tuesday of each month for the next couple of months. And please, if you're new here, please make sure you look at all of the adult learning offerings. Rabbi Kasher's teaching on Monday nights and about tefillah, about Jewish prayer, a way in, and a number of other learning opportunities for us nearly every day of the week. And now that we're back in person on Shabbat, I hope to see some of you in person soon. Blessings to all of you. Thank you.